It's literally turning this way.
Mhm.
I'm about to say, like, I'm not taking. All right, y'all, we are going to get started.
There. Here.
Hmm. Hey, y'all, we're about to get started soon. Bear with us, bear with us. Okay. Thank y'all so much for joining. We're about to get started. Wow, we got some folks from Baltimore, San Francisco, Raleigh, North Carolina, DC. Hey, y'all, Las Vegas, Cleveland, Ohio. Hey, Amanda from Portland. Okay, y'all in here. It's lit. It is lit, y'all. We're about to get started. Oh, someone from Atlanta. Let's go. Oh, someone from the United Kingdom. Pam, you got folks from the UK. Okay. You are worldwide, Pam.
Hello, everybody. We're getting started in a few minutes.
All right, y'all. We're about to get started so we won't belabor the time. Hello, everyone. How are y'all doing? Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are I'm so excited to be here. My name is Jamie Swift. I'm the executive director of Black Radicals. I use she, her pronouns. And we are here because Cam Morris, is leading the first ever in-person teach-in for the School for Black Feminist Politics. If you're not familiar with the School for Black Feminist Politics, it is the Black Feminist Political Education Hub and initiative of Black Radicals. And we're honored to have Cam here to talk about Black ecologies, right? Land and rights in the diaspora. First and foremost, I want to say this has been a long time coming, and I want to say thank y'all for supporting BWR. And most importantly, thank you for supporting Cam on their first teaching as well. And so without further ado, I just want to give it up for Cam Morris, who does amazing work. in the DC area. And also shout out to Anika Hobbs of Nubian Hueman and Kaylin and Kenya for organizing this event or help organizing this event. And just, yeah, thank y'all so much for being here. Okay, so give it up for Kian Morris.
Thanks, everybody. I feel like we've been waiting for this for so long. It's like, I feel things I imagined. Okay, so my name is Cam. I use they, them pronouns. This is our first in-person event, so bear with us. We hope we're gonna CP time today, but that's the glory of being Black. What is time? Let's create our own. So grateful for folks being in this space today. Do want to make just some housekeeping announcements. There's bathrooms. Folks will be coming in and out. Feel free to get up if you need to get up. Don't expect folks to stay in the same spot if you're uncomfortable. We'll be going over a lot of heavy text, a lot of stuff that has happened to Black folks that's violent, that will impact us for generations to come. So if something comes up and it feels heavy, feel free to give yourself space, step away, take a breath, rest your eyes on something other than the screen if you're watching from online. So here is my laptop, and I sort of have some visuals. It may be too small for folks to see, and apologies for that. I'm wondering if you can maybe bring that up just a little bit. It'll just be helpful to give us a visual of what is happening when I'm referring to certain themes in our space today. I'll also describe the visuals aloud so that folks are aware of what's on the screen. And do want to apologize that we weren't able to get ASL. We tried really hard and grateful for the folks who, are still able to be a part of the space. I do want to keep that in mind in the future spaces and to think about it as we debrief on this space and what things the space needed. I am no way claiming to have all the information and all the things about environmental injustice, Afro-environmentalism, Black feminist ecology. But I'm hoping that folks can understand a little bit of my perspective from my positionality in this world. So yes, I'll also be referring to my notes here, because I would like to describe myself as a neuro-expansive person, nigga, which means that, I need aids, I need support, and it's how I show up, and how I welcome other folks to show up in a space as they are. So let's get into it. I do want to start by sort of sharing more about the description. Today, we're going to go over a lot of themes, a lot of topics, a lot of issues, news stories. So feel free to just make space for that, and give yourself space to get your needs heard. So we'll be talking about sort of land liberation, land sovereignty, place, making home. What does it mean for Black folks? I'll refer to the visuals, and also open for questions, and hopefully at the end we can have space for that as well. So I want to just take a moment to just take some breaths. Sometimes I talk a little fast, but I also want to make space for our ancestors, the people who walked this earth before us, the people that walk earth after us, those that fought and won, those that showed resistance, those native to this land, those brought to this land through genocide, those who endured violence to get to this land, folks that are currently walking. I like to say I'm representing my ancestors right now in this moment, so I'm grateful to walk and uphold their legacy. So I'm just making space for people who, were impacted by colonialism, were impacted by imperialism, structures of violence, the military, displacement, and those who survived. I hope that this space will give us the ability to think more in the future how we can thrive in our communities and how we can create more spaces for conversation, and land liberation. I do wanna, yeah, I'll just take a moment to acknowledge that. I think sometimes in these spaces, it's easy to sort of compartmentalize particular issues, right? And so I guess I'm situating myself as a non-binary Black person, from Africa, from Black people, from Indigenous people, who did not align with colonialism, colonial gender ideologies, pink, blue, and who support me and understand me and give me the space to exist outside of binaries. So I'm moving to this first sort of slide that reads, to tend the earth is always then to tend our destiny, our freedom and our hope, by Bell Hooks. So yes, we're talking about Black ecology feminism, and I'm thinking about, I guess, elements of ontology as we dive into sort of this issue, particularly as it relates to Black folks' ability to be treated and valued as human, right? And so I see Afro-environmentalism as a race issue, as a class issue, as a nationalist issue, because we'll talk a little bit about like what does it mean to be a Black person living in the US, as opposed to someone who maybe identify as an African American, right? I'm a Black person born in the United States, but don't identify as African American or American. And like, what does that mean for my identity, the people who are part of my African ancestry, who were forced here and who lived here and called this place home. I'm thinking about like how Black folks have been fighting for sort of this access to humanity. And I think in most contemporary times, we see it in like Black capitalism, right? We see like Black people like, I need to be a billionaire, I need to buy back the block, in an effort to sort of gain this value that I think Black ontology like sort of teaches us under the systems, under the threat of violence, under the threat of white supremacy, under capitalist structures, is impossible. And so we see folks like really fight for classism, right? Get a degree, go to a HBCU, and we see the contradictions, right? You can go to HBCU at Howard, that's named after a white person, and experience racism, and experience classism, and experience homophobia, fatphobia. And so I'm also thinking about that in relationship to like servitude and sort of this transition from enslavement to the 13th Amendment, right? Making this clause around enslavement for folks who are incarcerated. And that in relationship to the US having that one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, and more than 50, 60, 70% of folks incarcerated being Black people, right? And we know it isn't because Black people are bad. These are structures that create the conditions for incarceration, for poverty, but there's a lot of connections between the state, land, environmental degradation, and liberation, those efforts. I'm also thinking about what it means to be Black, what it means to be Black and sort of fight for humanness, but also like what it means to be Black and have a close relationship with nature and the land. Black people have always used the land for everything, to even fight for their freedom. And so I'm thinking about what it means to be Black and have a relationship with like animals, right? What it means to be Black and fight against speciesism. What it means to be Black and acknowledge the fullness of nature, people, messaging, roads to freedom, and we'll sort of explore that a bit more. And so I'm sort of grounding this conversation also around like ideas around land sovereignty. What does it mean to return to origin use? in relationship to territory, resources, landscape, and elders, meaning the land as an elder as well. And so I'm also thinking about Black stewardship, ingenuity, Black indigenous. And so we'll be exploring sort of like embracing personal and communal responsibility and collective action, along with thinking about choosing community over self-interest. And so I really want to complicate conversations around Black stewardship, belonging, being Black, born in America, what that means for our relationship to the land, what that means for our relationship to land liberation. I'm also thinking in this definition of Black stewardship, sort of like rejecting Black capitalism, right? So it's not the idea that like, we're gonna buy back the block and then we're all gonna like get a part of this, right? We know classism teaches us that like, though, like in order for structures to exist and for a small percentage of people to thrive, there also has to be the structures that create exploitation, right? We're wondering how someone can be a billionaire, but Amazon workers are protesting because they can't go to the bathroom. So I'm thinking about problematizing the actual intention to sort of gain upward mobility. And I think like HBCUs sort of like teach that same thinking in vain. And so, yeah, we'll be like investigating that a little bit more. I'm also seeing this conversation grounded in the idea around anti-Black racism, right? And so that like, we'll be discussing various moments of genocide. But I want folks to sort of ground that in this ideology of global anti-Black racism, what that means, what that has meant historically, what that has meant for periods of enslavement, and sort of the transatlantic slave trade, what that means for Indigenous folks, right, native to the land, how anti-Black racism is a part of, has to be a part of conversations on land sovereignty, has to be a part of conversations on land back and repairing, because the structures that exist that sort of perpetuate this anti-Black racism impact all communities of people who sort of have ties to this land in various complicated, problematic ways. And so I'm going to go to the next slide here. So this slide reads, exploited people, land, and culture. And so in this slide, there's a picture of sort of a violent example. And I think an example that isn't inclusive, doesn't include all of the harm or account for sort of all the transitions that happened through the slave trade. And so the visual portrays Africa, South America, North America, and sort of arrows pointing to where folks were sort of violently taken to, right? And so I guess I'm thinking about like niggas be everywhere, meaning that like Black people are literally everywhere around the world, and are like always sort of like questioned or not included in conversations about nationalism, right? Outside of like Marcus Garvey, like I'll save the shade, but what does it mean to be like Black and living in the US with ties, right? And what does it mean for Black people to have been traded, our resources to have been traded? Because the visual represents sort of like the customs, the food, the resources that were also extracted and exploited from Africa. And we know, right, the queen just died, and the diamonds in her crown and in her ships can literally be tracked back to Africa, right? It can literally be tracked back to Black people who died to get this stone, right? And so there's a clear relationship to Black people being exploited to work on the land for colonialism, for imperialism, for white violence. And even in the Queen's last days, right, we're bombarded on social media by this crown, which is this big contradiction of Black people being exploited in Africa for like, I don't know if it's aesthetic or to sort of showcase in a way this sort of violent history. And so this map doesn't account for all of the ways that folks lost parts of their culture, lost parts of their tradition, lost parts of their languages to get here, right? So we Black people living in the US, separated from the things, not all, right? Because we know Black American culture is a thing, but with the gaps of violence that has led it to be in the US. So I just want us to kind of situate that when thinking about Black people being everywhere in the world, right? Thinking about coffee's from Ethiopia, but they don't talk about coffee being from Ethiopia at Starbucks, right? It's just like white people in line with the gym wear. So sort of this, thinking about this contradiction of what does it mean to be in the Black diaspora, a survivor of global terror, but someone who maybe wants to buy a home, right? And doesn't want to go through redlining or whatever, right? But it's directly impacted by the exploitation of colonialism to land, to African land, to land in the US, occupied land, to land in South America and also, right? Niggas everywhere. So situating that in our conversation today, as well as thinking about what I said, like being a Black American versus being African American, being Black as Indigenous, right? So I don't want to get into any hotepery, but I'm thinking about what does it mean for Black people to have been in the US for decades, hundreds of years, and even in relationship to Indigenous folks too, because I think the complicated history is that there are documents of Indigenous people enslaving Black people, but also Indigenous people being enslaved, right, through colonialism, being extracted from their land. And so that feels a lot more complicated than I think some conversations sort of mention. I'm also thinking about, how like Black and Indigenous people fought in wars together, beside each other, but also against each other, and the relationship between sort of survival, right? We've been in survivor mode a lot for a long time, not for a long time. And sort of we'll investigate sort of how contemporarily that has impacted Black folks living in the US. I'm also thinking about this in the relationship to like 40 acres and a mule. I'm thinking about this in relation to like belonging, both Black joy and Black rage. I think I'm someone who maybe doesn't make enough space for joy. But I'm also thinking about what space do we make for rightful rage? And I think there's like lots of texts about that. So I won't go on that too long, but I think it relates a lot to us belonging here and having space to exist outside of colonial structures that pit us in sort of those caricatures or just exploiting our personhood and our autonomies. I'm also thinking about, again, sort of like genocides as it relates to anti-Black racism. I'm thinking about the gender implications of environmentalism, Afro-environmentalism, Black feminist ecology. I think a good example of like the parallels between gender and sort of these structures that create, that impact our life outcomes. When I think about or like talk about like gender in relationship to incarceration, and how folks who are incarcerated, the most of the care they get, the letters, the phone calls, the visits, those are like women, those femme, those non-binary folks holding that sort of labor. And I think a lot of care labor that Black folks, Black femme folks, Black non-binary folks sort of relates to this sort of environmental fight as well, because many of the folks that have been leaders have been Black women, right? Losing housing, Black women tying themselves to trees and standing up against dictatorship in a way that maybe social or mainstream structures don't allow for or don't allow enough conversations about. I'm also thinking about sort of Black people belonging in relationship to the Great Migration. When I started doing genealogy work, I learned that my great grandfather rented land in Russell County in the late 1800s. And so I'm thinking about that and like my relationship to this land, like what is a relationship to a poor farmer or like an enslaved person or someone who may be indigenous to the land, renting land, because land was still exploited, right? There's this long history of land exploitation. What does that mean to like my stake in the US? Or if I even want that stake, right? But I think conversations like all Black people need to go to Ghana or like all Black Americans like, no, it's still given exploitative because like we know the passport is like violent. We know our relationship to the US does problematize us going to another country and having access to resource because we are from the US, having access to things that us being in the US sort of gives us the privilege to. And so what does it mean to be Black and born in the US? But thinking about your identity, thinking about how you fight for liberation outside of sort of like, yeah, head ass, like we need to go back. That also feels like exploitative to whatever land you're going back to, right? I'm also thinking about redlining, gentrification that we'll talk more about, and sort of Black flight. So how has like violence, structural violence, state violence, impacted the sort of long history of like Black people traveling, Black belonging, Black place. And so if you experience an instance of violence from someone close to you by the state, right? You see a friend or a loved one experience violence from the police. You see a friend or loved one experience violence in a mental health crisis. What does that mean for your identity and relationship to that land and your ability to like live, thrive? But I think also to you finding home in a place, to you finding safety, right? Because like humans, we need certain things to be able to like live, right? You know, they got like the problematic sort of hierarchy, but if our homes are at risk, if we like, if folks in our communities don't have access to stable housing, consistent housing, safe housing, that impacts our ability to find home, right? And generations to come. When you struggle with poverty as a result of the state, right? Exploited wages, racist practices for hiring and jobs, that impacts sort of your life outcome. And so you're blamed instead of the larger structures that have incited violence against African people, Black people for a long time. So I do want to talk about enslavement in the US. And so the screen reads Afro-environmentalism and Black stewardship. And it's sort of a joke. There's a meme that reads #GrowingUpBlack. You'll find it under a sink or a cabinet. These don't get thrown out, they get saved. And it's like just a lot of bags of like grocery store bags. And I think that's so funny, but I think that Black people have like ties to environmentalism that's inherent to us. And I think this is sort of like a funny example of how Black people use what we have, and how culturally other families sort of like relate to that thinking, right? We got to keep our pets bags. I don't know, we only gonna need them, but we got them when we need them. Big fact. And so I guess I'm problematizing like plastic bags in relationship to like how Black people used land during enslavement to escape, resist. I don't feel like people talk enough about Black people resisting enslavement. And I think C.L.R. James does a good example in his text to talk about like enslavement would not have ended had Black people not fought hard, continuously, all the time. And so it wasn't like Abraham Lincoln signing this, right? It was Black people were fighting regardless, like fighting that. And what does that mean for like our relationship to land? And thinking about folks using or like praying for the land to protect them, right? And so I'm also thinking about enslavement and sort of Black people successfully escaping or attempting escape and trying to use being a freedman as a way to like sort of execute that, right? But we know that like there are Black people that had documentation, right? Sort of our relationship to the nation that identified them as a free person, but can still be enslaved. And folks who escaped enslavement got to whatever place they needed to be considered a freedman, a free person, and still, right, running the risk by the state, a state structure, enslavement is a state structure, that system's still working to take those folks, right? Keep those folks enslaved, and sort of like this long history of nationalism or access to land not necessarily applying to Black folks, particularly those who are impacted by sexism, right? By colorism, by transphobia, by homophobia, and all the other systems that were created through sort of like colonialism, white ideologies. I'm also thinking about anti-foraging laws. And so when enslavement ended, it became illegal for Black people to go to the land, right? Collect things for healing, collect things for cooking. It was illegal, right? And that state policy literally working and intervening, or sort of Black people building power, collective power through herbs, through knowing the land, through having that smart insurance. And that sort of being a part of this narrative of environmentalism and sort of exploitation by the state. I think a few examples I'm also thinking about is like Black people running and resisting and using the birds, right, who are migrating north and following them on their journey to freedom. I'm thinking about Black people following the stars in the Milky Way to get to freedom, right? And now Black people, I know a lot of folks into astrology, not like social media stuff, but how Black folks have used literal stars, maths, to find freedom, how that relates to us now, right? I know we all are friends into zodiac signs, but our people, like, if you believe in stars, you gotta look, yeah. Astrology is math, but how Black people use stars to get to freedom. They relied on that. I'm also thinking about like, yeah, herbs for medicine and for poison, right? People were quick and very talented with herbal use. So in the ways that Black midwives could help create a concoction to dispel a pregnancy, they could also come up with concoctions to poison enslavers. And I don't think people talk about that enough, like Black people poisoning enslavers, Black people giving folks hell, right? I think we should talk about that more. I'm also thinking about like how folks use like quilting to like send messages. Again, midwives being really using their collective power to like send messages, warn folks about things, getting information, translating it so folks can escape to freedom. And I'm thinking about how folks use weed and marijuana as a way to resist, as a way to cope. And how folks still practice those traditions now to like navigate trauma. But weed as a healing agent, right? So how we can use CBD oil to sort of help with our pains, and hemp as a tool to help with pain and AIDS. But how policies and criminalizations have created the conditions where like Black grandmas think weed is bad, or like just furthering sort of this criminalization of like Black people thriving, having the resources that they need. I know I need to be high. But like, how is weed rooted in sort of anti-Black racism? How is weed rooted in the idea that it's harmful versus sort of like this healing aid that I think it's traditionally has been used in African traditions? And so I'm thinking about that now as we sort of think about moving past narratives of like criminalization to like Black people who smoke weed, Black youth, toward like a way of like really situating herbs as a part of things that we need to grow and thrive in our communities. I do want to talk about DC, because that's where we are. We are in occupied Piscataway and Anacostia land. And I do want to acknowledge that the people that walked this land, the people that fought on this land thrived here, took to nature, took to Mother Nature, took to trees for messages, to continue resistance, and those who died fighting on this land. And so I'm thinking about occupied Piscataway and Anacostia land in relation to the Pearl Escape of 1848. I'm gonna take a drink. Okay, so I'm thinking about the Pearl Escape in 1848. This visual here is of Black folks revolting, and they have all the weapons, and they're doing what needs to be done. But so this next image is an image of the Pearl Escape in 1848, April. It's one of the longest or largest documented revolts in the history of enslavement. There are 77 Black people who use the Potomac River to attempt to escape, but they were caught. And this image on the right is of two sisters, and their name is the Edmondson sisters. Them and some of their other siblings were a part of the attempt to escape. On the left, there is sort of a square image of the geography of this occupied land that we are on, that I am on. There is a visual of the Potomac River. So their plan was to travel south down the Potomac River, and then north through the Chesapeake Bay to freedom, but they were intercepted right at this point between meeting Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River. And I'm just using this as an example sort of to track how Black people took to water as a tool of power to escape, right? Needing the land, needing the river to lead them that way. And sort of how Black people through enslavement used water as a tool of power, water as a tool to fight and resist state structures, fight and resist policing, fight and resist violence, colonial violence in particularly, because we know structures of enslavement sort of profited off of, they did profit off of the exploitations of Black people, Black bodies, Black youth, and sort of this sort of making of the economic system in the US that exists today is through Black people being exploited, right? Their birthing labor, their young people, their babies, through a lot of violence and genocidal practices. And sort of thinking about what does it mean for someone to be a descendant of Black people who fought for resistance to be in the US? What does that mean to like us to be our relation to the nation, right? When we know the state was used all the time to combat our ability to seek freedom and still exists today. So I'm thinking about like DC as a city that has experienced like lots of gentrification, and I want to think about gentrification in relationship to its violence, displacement as violent, because in ways it's like getting evicted, right, which is a violent act Black people have experienced sort of this long tradition of like housing injustice in finding our relationship to the land, right? So thinking about redlining, Black person going to the bank to get a loan, being denied because of the area that it's in, or getting a loan from the bank with a high interest rate, but not knowing, or not even have access to visit a bank because you didn't have consistent income, or whatever barrier you may face at the hands of the state, and how that impacts your ability to self-determine where you live, self-determine what you eat, self-determine your own practice, mental health practices, how you want to raise your young people in relationship to sort of how we've been exploited for global profit. We've been exploited for Wall Street. We've been exploited for all of the ways that colonialism exists today. So yeah, so I'm thinking about sort of like ways of housing as a commodity in DC. I'm thinking about bus depots in DC, right? What areas are those in? The impacts on Black youth. Thinking about high lead rates, high asthma rates, and how like racism is literally in the air. And that being political because of those implications. I'm also thinking about in my neighborhood, Ward 5, how there's just a lack of playgrounds. Mm-hmm. And like, what does that mean for like young people developing, playing, learning, understanding their value and relationship to the nation, to the world, to their community? I think it's like the city's responsibility to build playgrounds, right? So relationship to the state. In their right to sort of need playgrounds everywhere for young people to grow. And so I talked a little bit about like land liberation, but not that the solution is like going back to this place and everyone gets 40 acres and we're going in land, like no. But that we do need to have deeper intentional conversations about what do we want and need for us as Americans, but also what is our relationship to fighting in solidarity with folks around the globe, right? Fighting with comrades around the world who are also battling state violence because of policing, because of prison, because of history of incarceration. And also thinking about how the resources in Africa have been extracted and exploited to the point that there's like public thinking that sort of confirms anti-Black racism instead of addresses the systems that led to the exploitations, the systems that led to an old white woman being able to like strut around with blood diamonds and like never being accountable to that, and never being accountable to sort of like the mountains of war and history of violence to Black communities. And so I'm thinking about that also in relationship to like the military being one of the world's biggest polluters. What does that mean for like me who wants to save the world, but I'm also like problematic because I like to buy shit. But like, is my buying shit doing as much as the military? Let me be accountable. I'm really. I'm also thinking about like land consumption as a result of prisons and sort of like how prisons exist today, the landscape, right? They're always far as fuck. And like, yeah, I think like, yeah, me and my sister are like sending pictures to our loved one inside. And the pictures got sent back to us because we were throwing up the peace sign and they read it as a gang symbol. And I'm just using that example to say in the way that like environmental injustice is directly tied to Black people being incarcerated, Black people experiencing flooding while incarcerated, Black people experiencing violence at the hand of the state while incarcerated, the food, all the elements, the way that folks are exploiting to jobs for like nickels a day, what that means for our psyche, what that means for the land, what that means for the advancements of like prisons and prison structures. So I did want to mention that let's go to the next slide. Yes, let's come in and out. Let's get up and stretch if y'all need to. So this next slide is sort of like two news clips. On the left, this is from CNN Today. It reads, Atlanta wants to build a massive police training facility in a forest. Neighbors are fighting to stop it. So that's like a direct example of the state exploiting the land and environment for violent gain, right? We know police don't need resources to do more policing. On the left, it's a news clipping from, and it reads, in SARS, Lagos Environmental Sanitation Unit to resume operations. And it's a news story about how folks were resisting and fighting to end SARS. And the state stopped folks' sanitation schedules as a way to push back against folks resisting something rightfully so. And so again, we think about environment, garbage, trash, like what does it mean for the state to use their structures to continue sort of this level of colonialism on our communities. And so this next slide is a visual of a spiritual practice before the Haitian Revolution started. I do want to go back 1 second, because I want to just mention that sort of I see Black people like taking space and making space in DC, and like how folks have rebranded as Chocolate City. And I think now it may not be as poppin' or like that language isn't used, but I think that's sort of like a direct example of like how Black people are like reclaiming and attempting to occupy, take space in land. I think the way that police are using woods or just land in general to expand and to become powerful, an example of land and environment exploitation. And it aligns for like this long history of the state using land to further create violent conditions for marginalized communities. Sort of in Chicago, there has also been this fight for a new police academy that would displace communities. But there's also this eerie relationship between like fucked up policing, like so police taking Black people to particular areas in our community to like abuse them out of a false confession, right? And so Black people avoiding those neighborhoods in Chicago at risk of state violence. But like, what does that mean to us finding home and like finding place and us still being everywhere? I'm bringing up this photo from the Haitian Revolution because I think spirituality is a large part of the narrative around like Black people finding home, Black people in environmental justice, Black people in Afro-environmentalism, Black feminist ecology and those ideologies. Spiritual practices have been very powerful in like all of the history of Black people resisting enslavement, thinking about Harriet Tubman having visions, right? And other Black people fighting for freedom, having visions, right? Being able to receive messages, being able to know the land from their ancestors, right, who walked it before, and being able to use spirituality as a tool to fight against oppressive structures, to create self-determination. Because we know in years prior, African traditional religions were banned illegal in African countries, right, to make room for Christianity. I won't go into that either. But I think it's important to think about like how Black people, I think there's been like a recent movement in like Black people using altars, Black people using herbs, Black people acknowledging their ancestors that passed, right? Elevating them. Because a part of our relationship to the land is acknowledging all the loss and the trauma that happened. So we gotta like pray and lift our people up in whatever way we see fit, right? I don't think I'm a spiritual president, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge grief, death, and how people find home and dignity in that, and that relationship to the land. So this next image is of Hazel Johnson, who is a pioneer and considered the mother of environmental justice. And so I think it's important, yeah, just to acknowledge like Black femme people, Black people that are non-binary, Black people who are fat and like a part of these spaces, Black people who are disabled, Black people who don't fit inside colonial structures as far as beauty, as far as prettiness, but who are fighting for Black liberation. And so I'm also thinking about the way that sort of elements of transphobia has hindered our understanding of like histories, our understanding of gender, our understanding of like people, place, belonging. Because I hate when folks are like, all the violent things that I think happens with things like pronouns and sort of certain things that the media deem as new, but Black people who took to the land were people who didn't align with colonial genders, right? They didn't have to choose between a skirt or pants. So I do want to take this moment to acknowledge Hazel Johnson, who fought for environmental justice in Chicago and Augill Gardens. She fought against toxic dumping, trash dumping. She fought for national and global policy to end dumping grounds, right? And we know that in relationship to environmentalism, there are a lot of Black communities who have dumping grounds in their areas that contribute to our life outcomes, the air quality, and our ability to thrive. And so she was big in fighting globally for Black people everywhere not to be impacted by sort of environmental degradation, against toxic waste, right? She fought for community safety. She fought for issues like class to be acknowledged and problematized in issues like environmental injustice, right? So while folks in the projects, while folks in the hood experience a particular level of environmental degradation or environmental injustice in relationship to rich Black people, right? In relationship to white people who may be poor. And so there are also other leaders who in history, I think it's important to acknowledge, like Wangari Maathai, Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison, who wrote about sort of Black people's relationship to nature, to animals, to place, to finding home. I do want to take a moment to talk about the contradictions. They're big, they're big. I'll try not to be that shady, but I'll be a little shady. So on the screen, this sort of graphic reads, Mike Epps and wife, Kyra, announced new HGTV series, Buying Back the Block. When I saw it, I was like, Mike Epps? Okay. So I'm like bringing up contradictions because I think it's so important for us to like center this in contemporary context, right? Black people wanting to enter like real estate, be small landlords, which is like, honestly, it just doesn't make sense why you want to be a small landlord and be a young Black person responsible for the upkeep of it. So I want to acknowledge that there have been contemporary fights that Black people have been leading that further land exploitation. And so earlier when I talked about like land sovereignty and land stewardship, it's a releasing of ownership right through a colonial structure. It's taking responsibility for our problem, like our issue, or like how Black people are problematic in relationship to the nation, right? In relationship to the nation's origin, but how Black people are indigenous people, how Black people are indigenous to this land as well, and how buying back a block doesn't liberate or change the material conditions of poor Black people, right? You buy back a block, you have this expensive ass condo, that's like a single family home, right? It's a 1-bedroom, right? The city might require you to have X number of affordable properties there. It's a single family home. People with multiple kids can't live there. It's a 1 bedroom or it's a studio. And it only furthers the agenda of Black capitalism and sort of this gap in solidarity from Black people based on class, right? It still leaves poor people poor. It still leaves landlords the ability to not accept a person for their apartment who have a criminal record or something, or whatever the gross thing that kind of create these structures. I think being a landlord is a very problematic role in the relationship to the exploitation of the land. Like, you can't own land, right? Even if you buy back the block, you can't own land, because ethically speaking, Black people, like, ethically speaking, you can't own land, right? It belongs to the people. And so Black people's attempt to sort of get away from state violence, right? If you're rich, you won't get stopped by the police. If you're rich, you drive Bentley, you might not get stopped by the police, right? If you are Black and you are established, if you are a celebrity, you won't get stopped by the police, right? But we know those things aren't true, right? You can be rich, you could be Michelle Obama or Barack Obama and still experience racism, right? Even though I think that, like, yeah, their relationship to state violence is very different than like a Black woman in Southeast raising kids, you know, like, I mean, let's be honest. And so I think it's important to consider how contemporary efforts to exploit land are counter to sort of like land sovereignty efforts, Black land liberation efforts. Because for me, this does the opposite of liberate. It just furthers exploitation, all in this sort of white supremacist vein that like money is the goal instead of building collective power, instead of speaking up in our communities for our needs. And so I'm also thinking about gentrification and how Black small landlords have participated in that, but also how, like, during the global pandemic, a Black small landlord might not have been able to pay their rent either, right? And what does that mean for like our relationship to land, our relationship to place, and what is our collective stake at being united in land liberation and taking back to the land for healing, for justice, and for liberation. And so I'm also thinking about, what does it mean to be Black and live in the projects? What does it mean to be connected as a small landlord to like corporations and like Koch brothers? What is like our limits around that? Because I know like Howard gets funding, like, don't blacklist me, y'all mean I can't. I know Howard gets funding from their tissue and the damn bathrooms from Coach, but like white supremacy is everywhere, right? It's like literally, like it might be in the fixtures of this building. The Koch brothers fucking, they own the steel or some shit. Like it's encrusted everywhere. And we just have to figure out like what we're willing to let go. And what's like at stake for us to get to where we need to be, because that's a shame. I'm also thinking about like Black Panther Party and other political organizations, SNCC, using like, I think it like in our times it would be like Uber services, right? As a way of resistance, right? SNCC folks organized Black people to get rides from each other so they didn't have to use the bus system. Right, Black Panther Party practiced squatting tactic as a way to build collective power, take land back, resist the state, resist structures. And it's the reason their organizing efforts are the reason that folks are working to put squatter rights on the book, but also developers are working against that, right? Developers are coming to court like, people need to be evicted, and like, how Black people have historically sort of been resisting that in their efforts for justice. I'm also situating this in sort of like natural disaster conversations in the way that Black people are criminalized, the way that Black people find home. I'm thinking about like Hurricane Katrina, right? Where were these state structures that were, their literal job was to support, right? But then when Ukraine happened, folks, I saw so many flags. I'm like, I always see these flags. And That's a big problem. But it also makes you think like, damn, like, so what is black people living in the nation? Like, what is the responsibility to like protect, to provide resources? What is our stake? Like, what are we willing to not accept? And how was like a natural disaster, like Mother Nature doing their thing, an opportunity for Black people to be called immigrants? Right? Like, y'all remember that shit? Like,
We remember it.
yeah. And I'm also thinking about like communities being displaced because of natural disasters and how classism creates the conditions where people can be exploited in that way and like have to find new homes. What does that mean for your relationship to the land? So yeah, y'all, I have this slide up here. The top is a news story that reads, "The homeless moms who took over a vacant Oakland home said they aren't going anywhere." It is referring to Moms for Housing, who was in the news a lot within the last 2 years around their squatting efforts. And so, yeah, they were taking over shit. They were taking over shit. They took over a home that wasn't being used, and were able to win that campaign, and took over that home, and they're planning other efforts to work and organize around housing justice. And the second is a visual of 3 Black people sort of like marching. And this is an example of Black people building a Black autonomous zone. And sort of at the end of this space for today. And I'm thinking about like, what needs to happen? Like, what are we gonna do, y'all? Like, what's the solutions? And I've been thinking a lot, I think personally, about like taking back to nature. Like, what do I know about the land? So like plant IDing is fun because you can use your iPhone and use the little eye to track. But also like, what is my relationship to land liberation, right? Like me being a homeowner, I don't know, like, I don't know what the material conditions would be or like what the shift that would mean for all Black people, especially poor folks. I'm also thinking about like, what is our connections to our ancestors? And I think like in a spiritual way, but not in a spiritual way, right? Like, what is our connection to the people that came before us, birthed us, know us, fought on this land, fought in the America, grew up here, died here? What is like our stake in that? And I'm also thinking about like how folks are using like Black autonomous zones, Black liberation zones, to like counter land exploitation and fight for that sovereignty and space. I'm also thinking about like what does it take as far as like interdependence? So how can we like rely on each other in that way? And I've seen like great transformative justice sort of like thinking around that, like us needing each other, right? We must love and protect each other. We are each other's business. We are each other's harvest. Black women talking about like, yeah, like we are all indebted to each other to fight for liberation. And structures like Black capitalism further individualism and not what not even what's natural to like Black people as far as our tradition and culture. And so I'm thinking about how do we sort of return to the land? How can we be fighting for community care, bodily autonomy, right? Reproductive justice, reproductive rights. We know Black folks have been like pioneers in like birth and justice work. How does that relate to Black liberation, right? Because if you need to give birth in a historically racist hospital, what does that mean for like your body to live in a community with the historically racist hospital and be wanting to have a child? As well as like, what has like medical exploitation played in our birthing outcomes, in pushing people that are giving birth into C-sections versus other things, in pushing us away from using midwives and doulas, criminalizing, right? Because it was like, white people was like, midwives had to get degrees, and it was like, what? niggas been doing this forever. Like, what, like, but it's also like an example of state violence. And so I'm also thinking about like, what does it mean for like reparation conversations? And the potential like collapsing of the ecosystem as a result of capitalism. Like, what are Black people prepared to do? What do we need? And I don't necessarily know if I have like the answer, but I think it's been interesting thinking about transformative justice, thinking about safety, community, and healing, thinking about our relationship to land, our relationship to nature, our relationship to animals, right? We know that, I think my sister was like giving me something to read from Undrowned. And she was discussing how like whales going back to their primal state of breathing would account for a large mass of like forest oxygen, or like the things that like we need for like us to breathe healthy, how like we are like literally relying on nature, on animals, and like I guess sort of thinking about that in our relationship to Black liberation, our relationship to like land justice, safety, care, community. I think that's all I have, y'all. I talked a long damn time.
No, you should see the comments on IG, so good. I know that there's several comments on Zoom. Give it up for Cam Morris.
I do want to ask the questions. I'm like, I don't know if folks like tired, understand, y'all, should we ask questions?
No, there's questions.
Yes.
I'm gonna let you take a breath for a second. And just say that, once again, this is the first in-person teach-in for the School for Black Feminist Politics, which is the Black Feminist Political Education arm and hub of Black radicals. And grateful for Cam for leading another teach-in earlier on reproductive justice, and now leading this on Black ecology. And there's several people with a lot of questions because you touched on a lot of topics. And I have a question. I have so many questions, right? Does anyone have any questions for Cam, right? I know that there's someone Zoom on IG Live, but folks have questions? Yes.
I know I came in late. One, I love the presentation.
Thank you.
But I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on, do you think it's possible to live in a capitalist society without helping to like perpetuate capitalist values or norms? Because for me, like, I'm so happy you brought up real estate. It's something that I've been kind of like contending with. Is like, I'm in school studying real estate development, getting my master's in that, and kind of what I want to do is to invest in Black communities, to make home ownership affordable, but then to also be the landlord and, you know, build profits that way. So I've kind of been thinking like, dang, I am a Black capitalist. Like, you know, profits are at the forefront of my mind when I think about investing in property. But I'm like, what do I have to be willing to sacrifice in order to like kind of be a vanguard for Black liberation? And then what does that look like? You know, so it's like I can't do it alone. So like, where do I find like people that like we can maybe find innovative ways to invest in property in our communities, and also make affordable housing, affordable rental units like accessible. So I don't know if that is one question.
Yeah, I think, I think that's a good question. I think like, yeah, I think my orientation is that we are all like commodities in the system of capitalism to a certain extent. I also think that like community organizing is a good way to sort of situate and like sit with these things. For example, right, like Black people fighting in political organizations in the 60s were battling these same things, dealing with redlining, right? I guess like my orientation to like change or understanding is that the most marginalized communities have to be like liberated in our work. And I think like sometimes what I see like with affordable housing versus free housing is very different. I don't want to break up no political ties, but like, no, for real, I think like affordable housing is like affordable to who, like it could be affordable to some people, but is it affordable to all people? And I'm also seeing like a landlord is sort of like this individual role in it, that like I see other opportunities as far as like collective housing. I see like Black people like, yeah, building housing together. I know in DC, like there's folks in Baldwin housing that are thinking about sort of like, yep, co-ops as a way to sort of like resist, but also like, I think it's real that we have to gain financial wealth or like financial sort of like grounding in some way. But I think there are some ways that may not be you being a landlord, but like you being in a co-op, you being in like a timekeeping co-op, and like folks exchanging labor for time, folks exchanging labor for other things like bargaining with folks. I think that's like a tradition and a culture that Black people have had. That's a good way for us to engage in our relationship with the land. Because I do think it's a real thing to like want to maintain a level of class, a level of like money to like live and thrive. But I also want to know like, what's your line, you know? Because it's like, yes, we could fight for affordable housing, but what's the line? Is affordable housing over 1,100 for rent? Because that's not, you know what I mean? Like that might not be affordable. And also like, what are Black people that wanted Black liberation? What have they done in the past to fight for like land liberation, to fight to like give Black people financial stability in a way that like, I think mutual aid sort of is different from like charity, you know? And I think like investigating those structures more will like also help you think about like, what is your role? Because I think like the landlord also creates like a savior complex, and it's like complicated because like you like a landlord's role is like exploiting the land, but I think it's also like people deserve to live and thrive too, right? So what's our stake to each other in that?
So I have a question. So when you were talking about the land, it really made me think about, you mentioned solidarity, and I think about how Black people, like Black folks in Jamaica and Colombia and Brazil, with the Maroons and the Palenques and the Quilombos, how they also, created these Maroon communities for liberation and safety, right? And I think that they're excellent examples of, abolitionist organizing, right? But I also know that currently, particularly in Brazil, right, there's a lot of religious terrorism happening with not only the Quilombos, but the land and developers wanting to take over the land, but also with the tejeros and the temples in Candomblé. For example, my host mom, she's a Candomblé priestess, and she has a tejedo or a temple, and the type of religious terrorism that happens there, and them trying to take down her temple or over her temple, reminds me of gentrification here. My question overall is like, how do we really be in solidarity with folks, not only here in the US, Black folks, but in the diaspora? Because I think solidarity is a term that's thrown out there a lot, but it's never like really in practice. Like, I remember the Black squares where Black Lives Matter, and like white folks thinking that they were allies with the Black squares. But I also think that as folks in movement, Black folks in movement, we talk about solidarity, but we don't really mean it, because it's like, oh, what about us? Oh, okay.
That's the problematic part. I'm just adding that point, like,
Yeah,
Black people caught on to it, but it was 2 Black women in the music industry that said,
That's
we're
right.
gonna black out these social media feeds, and so everybody who's woke, right, white woke folks in the industry followed suit. And so then there's this dichotomy between Black trans organizers and brown, and so on and so forth, and use that platform to say, hey, come out and show up, and people can't access that because Black folks are not talking to them.
yes. And to emphasize my question even like further, thank you. For that.
Yeah.
No, like, so what do we do if you have people like, oh, want to be in solidarity, but other people like, what about us here in DC? Because we have our own problems in Southeast DC. So what does Brazil have to do with us?
I mean, I think generally we need more conversations about like our connections to each other globally, like that you can be Black and live in a different country outside. I don't know. I think there's a problem with nationalism in relation to people living in the US having a certain privilege. And I think that we enact that privilege in like our ignorance about global issues, right? Our ignorance about state violence impacting Black people everywhere, about birthing injustice, right? About folks using sterilization, right, in Puerto Rico in the 1970s, right? It was like 1/3 of Puerto Rican women were sterilized because of the United States occupancy. And our liberation is connected in that way that like Black women are like, we need each other, like we need each other, y'all, like we need solidarity to be, and I think like it's not like, oh my gosh, there's an issue, we all should fly there, right? I think it's like having like a camaraderie relationship with each other so that when there are things happening, we are even reactionary, right? Because we are strategizing, we have relationships and we know what the political climate is in our comrades in this place. Because I think it's not like we need to be there, but we might need to do outreach on social media, right? We need to pressure this police station to release these 10 people, right? It might be we are sending supplies. It might be we're getting folks skilled up on a particular issue, right? Folks want to do red level actions, right? Folks want to do some type of protesting. How can we use our resources and our internet to talk to folks? And so I think there's a lot of ways that we can build relationships to each other, and there's a lot of ways that our liberation is tied to each other, right? And so in ways where there is like an uprising in a country, how could we have like maximize that in the US, right? When folks in other countries are fighting against reproductive rights and winning, how can we have used that moment to fight for people to not be criminalized while seeking abortion care? But I also think it's messy because like, I think conflict is a part of us as humans, right? Like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King's beefed up. Malcolm X called him what do you call my Uncle Tom? I said, ooh. But I think like, that's funny. I guess I'm thinking about like the fraudery too, like the media contradiction, right? I think as a community organizer, I'm sitting with my own contradictions, my own self-righteousness, things I need to reflect on and process, but also how folks' egos have led to like us not like your ego led to like us not winning a campaign, or we're playing the action and you want to be the nigga that's with the mic and we couldn't even say what the fuck we wanted to say, and now the police the media gone or some shit. It's like, yeah, I think it's a big contradiction between like what people want the public to think about them. We need therapy. We do need therapy. And like, what relationships are we building with people everywhere who are fighting against state violence?
Does anyone else have any questions here for Pam? Because I think there's some questions.
Yes.
I'm trying not to have my face up in here. Let's see, y'all.
Yeah, yes.
Yes, go ahead, go ahead.
Tight or to speak. I'm Chris. I just was curious about, I guess looking about my question one. One of them is, how do you imagine, or what do you imagine the future or a world to look like on land that is fully liberated and reclaimed? And tying into that, what are some of the languages and terms that you're using to describe that? Or some of the things you're trying to do away with?
I think I see like the Black radical tradition being pivotal in land liberation and transformative justice. So not only like how we keep each other safe, like instead of calling the police, what can we do? But also like what care practices are we like developing to take care of each other that isn't like we need to call an ambulance, but we know the person on our block has medical experience in X way. So I think it like requires like a rigor, like folks got to be serious. Even me, I have to be more serious and disciplined. But But I also see like Black people feeling safe, like Black people having like the agency and the autonomy to self-determine. And so you don't have to like fight with the education system about your young person being suspended for their hair. They don't have to go to a colonial established school, right? They can go to school and maybe in your neighbor that teaches, and they teach like 10 young people, right? We don't have to exist in the structures that exist right now. We don't have to like work 5 days a week, 7 days a week, overtime. We could turn to the land, and we could turn to each other and not prioritize capitalism, political gain, self-preservation, because I think that's like what it is, right? Identity crisis and folks being like, if I get to the top before, but I also think like, I don't know, everybody can't come too, like, yes, everybody can't come in the sake that like, how long can we have, like, what are conversations advancing as far as gender liberation, as far as transphobia, right? I can't be in the same conditions as, I can't be living and thriving around homophobia, around transphobia, around fat phobia, ageism, and all the other like violence systems that I think exist and keep us oppressed. And so a part of it is like totally destigmatizing what we learn, what we think, and like going back to African traditions, taking to the land, building our customs, in a way that we think is fit, that I think also acknowledges again, like our role and like the problematic role of Black people living in the US, but also our relationship to like being indigenous to the US. And so something that accounts for like all of that. So I think it's like land back, land liberation. It's like Black people having liberated zones. It's like Black queer feminism, Afro-environmentalism, and all these other things that I think give us the room to like see each other and not center ourselves, not center individualism, not center like the rigor or like the needing to get to work at 9, needing to like be done with work at 5. It gives us the ability to like learn differently. Like I always be like, yeah, like I like to say that I'm neuro expensive so people understand, but it's also like growing up in Chicago, I'm paranoid. Like, like I'm paranoid. I think I'm gonna get robbed a lot. I might could. And how the state, like how violence, community violence has like terrorized me in that way, but like how that impacts how I learn, how I walk down the street. But that I also need like healing and to like process that trauma in order to like live and thrive too, right? So I don't enact my own trauma on other people.
Wow, that was an amazing question. It's actually the same question someone else asked, so that the 2-for-1 special, okay? But y'all, we're gonna wrap it up because I know that Cam, it's been a lot of talking, right? A lot of speaking, but just really thankful for your insights. I learned so much from you. You went all the way from basically 1619 to Hurricane Katrina to, talking about what's going on in DC. And you should see the comments. I've saved the chat. It's really popping in that Zoom chat right over there. And just thank you for your expertise. And we'll have other in-person teachings, right? This won't stop, and we're really excited for the expansion of the School for Black Feminist Politics. And hopefully in the next few years, having a physical location where we can learn at the feet of people like Cam Morris. So thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out.
I'm gonna put my big head over here, y'all. Okay, y'all. Thank y'all for being here. We got folks from Germany. Randolph, Massachusetts. Wow. Thank y'all for being here. This conversation will be uploaded to Black Radicals YouTube. So yeah, you can learn more from the Cam Morris. Like, I'm sorry for embarrassing you like that, Cam. All right, I'll see y'all later. Have a good one. Oh, folks from Hawaii. Okay. You popping.